Hello, dear class. After, I guess, not a long silence, if you received my Harry Stottle videos, if you had a look at those, but still it seems forever. And of course, we've moved on through the millennia from Athenian tragedy to the turn of the 20th century when Chekhov, born in 1860, was writing. And I'd like to throw a few words at you preparatory to your. Oh, they're warning me to charge my phone. Well, there's a little life in it left. There's life in the old dog. Preparatory to the quiz I'm going to throw at you, which will ask a couple of questions, but also may ask your opinions. More interesting to me than answers to flat out questions. So, Chekhov, who revolutionized theatre in many ways, because until he wrote his plays, the idea that, as he saw it, people could be eating a meal, and there's one in particular in The Three Sisters, the other play that we're going to read, people could be eating a meal and hearts will be breaking, and no one says so. To put that on a stage, a drama that was so interior that you knew what was going on in these people's lives without their having to say so, that was an art that had not been practiced because it seemed too difficult. Obviously in Elizabethan theatre, I wonder, you're not seeing that as it flashes onto the screen in front of my face, a little air message. In the classical theatre and in the ancient theatre, there was no problem about telling the audience what your thoughts were. You came to the front of the stage, probably, or you just stood where you were, and you said, I'll tell you what I'm thinking now. I'm thinking I'd like to kill that chap over there. But in realistic theatre, you have to devise ways in which those thoughts can be uttered. And on being uttered to other people, lose their 100% true ring of confidence. There's always a reason why people are telling other people something, but if they tell you, the audience, then that is a confidence. Now, that's not possible in realistic theatre, although in Chekhov's plays there are moments where characters appear. There's one in Three Sisters, famously, which we ought to discuss when it comes to it next week. But by and large, they're relating to each other in a realistic manner, more realistic than had ever been seen on the theatre stage before. The 19th century, when Chekhov was born, was largely a century of melodrama where people... I'm sorry, I was remembering the classic description of melodrama where people saw terrible deeds and dramas and agonies, and the famous line which was of the son finding the son separated from his mother and finding her at last dying in a gutter somewhere, and he exclaims, "Dead." Oh, no, maybe. It's the other way around. The mother who finds the son dying in the gutter and exclaims, "Dead, and never called me mother," was the famous line that described all melodrama. And close your ears now, please, as I'm about to speak, those of you with tender souls, because the tradition was that some bold, rude, horrible-spirited person in one of the boxes overlooking the stage at one of those terrible reunions, too late reunions, would shout out, and this is where you shut your ears, please, "Fuck her while she's hot." It was that unpleasant a world of melodrama. The suggestion was never taken up, and it was left until 100 years after Chekhov's birth in the 1960s, when it became almost required, de rigueur, as the French would say, to have live sex on stage. This began in London in the 1960s and spread, and I don't know how common it still is, perhaps quite common. I met the girl once on a train who took part in the first live sex act on the British stage in a place called the Roundhouse. And she was not an actress of note, but it was of note that she was the first. I don't know whether she gets into the Guinness Book of Records for that, probably not. So what's happening on the Chekhovian stage is that small things are resonating hugely in people's lives, and that doesn't always work for readers. Most people who come and see a good production of Chekhov are wooed by it, but not everyone is wooed by the work on the page. For me, it was like coming home. I found at last the world of literature that I needed, I had never known existed. And not everyone felt that. The great novelist D.H. Lawrence always referred to Chekhov as Willie Wetlegs, meaning just somebody, just a coward, a kind of, he didn't dabble in the ecstatic sexual encounters, of gigantic meaning and resonance and luscious language that Lawrence lived for. And mostly people in Chekhov's plays are thwarted in love or fall in love with the wrong person or are unable to declare their love for the right person. Something that you either feel, oh, God's sake, get on with it. Shit or get off the pot. This girl is not for you. She doesn't care about you. Go away. Or they feel, as I certainly felt when I was 14, when I discovered Uncle Vanya for the first time, I felt, oh, God, that's me. So here's a story about landowners in a distant part of Russia, stuck with the Russian snows and trying to make enough from each harvest to survive and send money to a beloved member of the family. The origin of this story is one whereby a character called Vanya Voynitsky, Uncle Johnny Voynitsky, had a sister, now dead, who married a famous professor in Moscow. And she died, sadly early, we don't know what of. And so the professor, in a sense, inherited the oversight over her property, this beautiful farm, which technically she had left to her niece, Sonia. They had no children of their own. So legally the farm is Sonia's, but the professor has a kind of moral authority over it, and they've been sending him money all these years, which they save carefully. Every last sou they send to him in Moscow, proud that they are supporting his academic endeavors. When he shows up, they begin to see that he's actually an old bore, an old fraud, caught up in dry, meaningless academic quarrels, and which his old mother follows with great attentiveness in the play, and which lead Vanya to realize finally that he's been working for an old fool all these years, sending him all this money, because the old fool arrives with a gorgeous young wife who entrances everybody. As somebody in the play remarks, you may remember, everything's fallen apart since you two came to stay. They're there on a visit. We've let the crops go, we don't make food on time, the samovar's tea is cold, all because we're totally fascinated by you, they say to Helen or Yelena in the Russian, the gorgeous young wife of the professor who was entranced with him a few years back when he was still in his pomp and had the authority that professors sometimes do over their female students. So she now knows he's a maddening, completely self-centered old bore, but has been loyal to him. And she's a classic Chekhovian character because she seems to be an airhead, but she's not. She's actually one of the smartest people on the stage, and the things she says are insightful and profound. She simply hasn't been given a chance to be that insightful and profound person by the rules of female behavior in the Russia of the time, pre-revolutionary Russia. The revolution was, thank God, to sweep all that away and give women opportunities that they had not hitherto had. And Chekhov writes all the time about the revolution by default, even if nobody mentions it. It is the thing that is going to sweep away the nonsense and the rules that govern people's lives in his plays. They philosophize about the future, but it's very grandiose. What will we think? What will they think of us in 100 years' time? Chekhov's characters are always saying. But more immediately, there's a question of being done with what the revolutionaries of Lenin's time, soon after Chekhov's death, would have seen Chekhov's landowner characters as a class of wastrels who should be thrown out and the land given over to their peasants. And although that's exactly what the purpose was of the revolution, Chekhov and his plays were, interestingly enough, not thrown out because they saw him as being both tenderly loving and sympathetic towards his characters, but also critical. You saw that they were a lot of idlers, and they are both idlers and they are serious. They are people with lives, with tragedies, and is it a tragedy? That's something we should be talking about if we were all together. And they have substance, like Astrov, who says, look, I'm just this lazy old fool with a gigantic mustache that I've grown, and my life is just all nonsense. But he's in fact a deeply attractive man because of his environmentalism, his passion for the forests, his concern for the disappearance of the animals. And so we, like Yelena, fall in love with him in a way that we cannot, and Yelena cannot fall in love with poor old Vanya, who is forever complaining that he could have had a life. He could have been a great man. I could have been a Dostoevsky. He cries. But Vanya is the center of it because his is the wasted life, of which we might say it's a tragically wasted life. Or we might say, no, there's no tragedy here. It's just pathos. It's sad. It's a pity. So this arguably is what tragedy, old Athenian tragedy, has turned into, which is the sadness of wasted lives as subject matter for theatre. And Chekhov, even if nothing in his plays speaks to you, is on the whole placed on a pedestal with Sophocles and Shakespeare as the three greatest dramatists ever to have lived. Greatest because people throng to his plays, still, Chekhov's plays performed all over the world all the time. Lovely parts for actors, as I'm sure is evident, but also a delicacy of humour and surreal humour that is sometimes it's almost impossible to figure out what the magic is if you look at the end of Act 2, where Sonia has gone off to ask the professor's permission to her father's, I get confused about the relationships, I've known this play all my life, permission to play the piano. The old professor is very picky about not being able to get to sleep. And Yelena is left alone. And she does talk then. She speaks, in a sense, to the audience, to herself, but in what is still a classic mold of soliloquy, which contemporary playwrights still write as well. People alone on stage, they speak. They can speak because they're never actually alone, because we are there. And she speaks of what she's feeling. And I've got another air message on my forehead, if you've seen it. If you've seen it, asking me to make a phone call, please make that phone call for me. So she's gone away and left Yelena on her own. And Yelena caught in the classic Chekhovian mixture of moods of laughter and tears. And then finally Sonia comes back in and Yelena turns to her and Sonia just says, "We mustn't." And in some great productions I've seen, they both then burst into laughter because it's so classic that the professor won't even let the piano be played. And the two girls, the two women, are utterly united in their experience of male tyranny at that moment. And their unitedness, their happiness at having someone with whom to share that, is what creates that wonderful laughter. It's a moment we mustn't. How could that ever be a great last line of an act of a play? But it's one of the greatest. Anyway, I'll I'll be right back at you, if that's all right. My 15 minutes is almost done, but I will make another little one of these videos if I may. Hope this finds you well, my dears. Bye.